Hello everyone, Nathaniel Gavronsky here, and I'm in Chicago, Illinois, Cook County, and we're going to talk a little bit about the history of this area. So Cook County actually gets its name from Daniel Pope Cook. He was the second representative in Congress to represent the state of Illinois. He was the state's first attorney general, and he was instrumental in getting Illinois statehood. Chicago itself gets its name from a wild clove of garlic that the natives would call Chicago. Now, the very first reportings we ever have from Europeans in the area about this place comes from Robert de la Salle in his book published in 1688 about his travels through this area. He talks about the smelly area of the water because of this clove of garlic or wild onion or whatever you want to call it. Now, the tribes around here, the Mississippi people, that native tribe here, in fact, that confederation had one of the largest cities in all North America, and by population rivaled the great capitals of Europe like London and Paris. After we have the French kind of moving in with Louisiana, New France, we start seeing, a lot of trade here in the region, but no one was really settling the area. The very first non-native settler in the area was a guy by the name of Jean-Baptiste Pont de l'Estable. He was born in Haiti to a French mercantile father and an ex-slave mother. Now, once his mother dies, he travels back to France with his father, where he improves his French skills. He learns the language of English and Spanish. He becomes cultured in all the educational of the Enlightenment period. It's starting to develop here in Europe, and he then starts to travel with his father, and he takes sail on his own, but he gets shipwrecked off the coast of New Orleans, and he gets into New Orleans just as the Spanish are kind of taking over the city. He's at risk of becoming enslaved himself. He escapes up the Mississippi all the way to what is now Chicago. Now, he settles a little trading post, because again, a lot of trade here with the natives is taking place, and on the north side of the Chicago River, right along Lake Michigan, is where he sets up his trade post. He sets up, his homestead. This is around 1780. Now, he is actually arrested during the American Revolution because the British thinks he's a spy. He's married to a Potawatomi Indian woman that he calls Catherine, who helped get his release from the British, and he would continue his trade post here, and it would, really start building up around 1799. He would leave this area on May 7th, 1800. He would sell all of his acreage. He would then move to Peoria, Illinois, and then later to St. Charles, Missouri, where he would die in the year 1818. The continuation of Chicago. So in 1803, the U.S. government establishes Fort Dearborn. This fort is established and serves out through the War of 1812, when it is destroyed by native attackers, which are part of a great conflict between British and natives here, which were on the side of the United Kingdom, of Great Britain in this war. After the War of 1812, when the United States is actually able to secure this area for themselves more permanently than what they had after the Revolution, they rebuild the fort in 1816. This fort would continue service until 1837, when Chicago actually becomes officially incorporated as a city. Now, Chicago would start to grow pretty rapidly. Again, we have a lot of trade posts here. You start seeing like the cities of Dubuque, Iowa, Burlington. Well, these are actually part of the Wisconsin Territory at this point. They're starting to develop. You start seeing beginnings of like railroad travel, and Chicago is becoming the hub for all of this. So Chicago is booming. It's growing exponentially, but it's growing actually too fast. See, the Chicago River initially flowed into Lake Michigan, and as the population grew, the water quality suffered tremendously here in Chicago because there's just too many people, and the sewage got too bad, started contaminating the lake. So they started to reverse the flow of the Chicago River to where it would eventually flow into the Mississippi watershed. However, that really didn't solve the problem. There was still a lot of flooding, and Illinois is really flat. Chicago was level with Lake Michigan, and so it would constantly flood. So about 1855, just a few years after they found the Chicago Board of Trade in 1848, they start to raise the street level up. Well, the buildings still stayed at the original level, and they continued to flood. Now, a lot of waterborne diseases occurred from this. A lot of people died. So they needed to figure something out. So what Chicago did is they picked it up. They didn't leave, they just picked it up. They literally brought in jacks, and they jacked these old buildings. They jacked them up over 3 to 4 stories in some areas. And Chicago is actually, what you see the modern city is actually built over the original layout of the city, 3 to 4 stories, depending on where part of the city that you're in. Chicago would continue to grow. It would continue to, and as people were moving these buildings, some of these were being moved, a couple of miles down where they were originally built. Nothing stopped. Businesses didn't stop while they were moving. They continued to operate. And during this time, newspapers talked about how people could see, 9 or so structures moving down the streets and avenues to their new locations. But the problem was that still a lot of these buildings were made out of wood. And as this population density was so tight here in Chicago that it became, a recipe for disaster. And then you have October 8th, 1871. You have the Great Chicago Fire, the night Chicago died. Now, leading up to this point, especially through the Civil War, Chicago was becoming heavily industrialized. You had all these steel mills moving up here, and when Chicago was under fire, and a third of the city was destroyed, they started rebuilding the city the very next day. And so everyone got out, they got their shovels out, they started cleaning up the rubble, and they went to work rebuilding. So what you have is now you have architecture and design has grown, and they're now building buildings with still structure, with still frames. And you get the world's first skyscraper here in Chicago, Illinois, the Home Life Insurance Building that was finished in 1885. It was only 10 stories, but the reason why it's a skyscraper and how any skyscraper gets the title skyscraper is that it was actually taller than the Chicago Fire Department's tallest ladder. It couldn't reach the top of it, so any building that could reach that was known as a skyscraper. One of these early examples is actually the Roosevelt Building that still stands. Now, the Home Life Insurance Building is no longer with us, but Chicago did keep building. As you can see the great skyline behind me, there's a tremendous building boom here in Chicago. Chicago became the country's second largest city, and it diversified its economy beyond just that of industry. It had a world-class economy, from trade to insurance to really any type of commerce you wanted to find here in Chicago. It was, at one point, it was there was the largest meatpacking operation in the world here in the city of Chicago. Well, a couple of things interesting about the city of Chicago is that the reason why it's in Illinois and not Wisconsin was that Wisconsin was quite a long ways from being really organized. And a congressman by the name of Nathaniel Pope actually saw that the need strategically for Chicago to be within a state of Illinois. See, Illinois goes down really very far south into the southern parts of the country. And this is 1818. The Missouri Compromise is only a few years away, and that divide between North and South is already becoming very self-evident. And so a lot of members of the northern delegation of Congress that said, we need to be able to have control of the Mississippi watershed. We need to have good access to Illinois. Be able to get all the way down through the Mississippi. Illinois controls a lot of that watershed for the old Northwest Territories of the United States. So it was important that they had that control. And Illinois was going to be an organized state. And so there was a really big push to move the border, which was originally level with Indiana, 50-some miles north, to include Fort Dearborn and then Chicago. So Chicago becomes fully incorporated in 1837, same way as you see the decommissioning of Fort Dearborn for the second time. And as Chicago continues to grow, all of this commerce keeps going. As you start seeing, beginning of the 20th century, you start seeing this massive migration from former sharecroppers up into the northern cities where the industry is. Most of the steel mills and industry was in the south side of Chicago, so that's where all these former sharecroppers moved to. And that's where a lot of them, their descendants are actually still there today. That's where these neighborhoods originate from. As you start getting through the World War One, and the bustling, hustling, and you have the Roaring Twenties. Now, the Roaring Twenties and Prohibition, you see Chicago become a gangland. The north side by Bugsy, the south side by Al Capone. Now, Chicago was basically lawless for a long period of time during this because the gangs ran everything. They bribed everyone they needed to bribe, and this actually culminated to the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929. And that was actually one of the biggest turning points in Prohibition. And you started seeing, a few years later, it was repealed by FDR, and then you start going into the Great Depression. But again, Chicago was a very diversified economy. So even though the Depression hit, it wasn't so much, Chicago wasn't so much based on finance. There's still industry here. There was a lot more. So Chicago actually did better than a lot of other cities did during the Depression. It wasn't great, but they did better. Now, you're going into World War II, the economy booms. You have the late 40s and the 50s, Chicago booms. 60s, things are even better. But then you start getting into like the Rust Belt phenomenon, where a lot of, outsourcing begins to take place. And a lot of those, the Steel Belt becomes the Rust Belt for everyone but Chicago. Because of its industry being diversified, its economy being diversified, it had a lot of other things going for it. In fact, in 1970, when a lot of other cities started to dwindle, Chicago built the Sears Tower. And it was the tallest building in the world until 1998. A lot of the buildings in Chicago, when they were built, they were the tallest buildings in the world. Hancock Tower, the Aon Building, a lot of these buildings were built as the tallest building in the world. Also, Chicago's got some of the greatest architecture in the world. Especially when they started building after the fire, they started building all these these specialized homes for everyone. They were all built out of steel and Illinois granite. It had that internal combustion that really kept the economy going throughout the centuries, and it was a great benefit to everyone in Chicago. Leading into the 1980s, we were still seeing a boom here in Chicago. And in fact, Chicago was still the second largest city in the country until the late 1980s, when LA finally took it over in 89, 90, really. And so Chicago has its own culture. It's got its own dialect even. It's got major league sporting teams in baseball, 2 of them actually, football, soccer, hockey, everything. Chicago's got it all. It's got its own version of pizza. It's got their own version of hot dogs. Everything that everyone else has, Chicago has its own version of it. In fact, it's the only city, in my opinion, in North America that could rival New York City. Even though that some of the names of the buildings have changed, the architecture keeps growing. Trump built his new Trump Tower here, the Waterfall Center. I mean, all these buildings, they're built to represent or look like something. Some of them are actually built to look like naughty bits, but we won't get into all of that right now. So Chicago is also known as the Windy City. Okay, now the Cincinnati Enquirer in the 1876, they gave this nickname to the city, a little bit because a tornado came through town, but also since 1860 until 1996, no less than 28 national party conventions, either Republican or Democrat or a third party, took place here in Chicago. So with all those politicians, there's a lot of hot wind going around, and so the name stuck. And so that's kind of one of the reasons why Chicago is known as the Windy City. Chicago has everything. It's a world-class city with a world-class economy. Yes, there's reports a lot about crime stuff in Chicago, but comparative to overall, it's actually not that high. And even compared to other cities, its size, it's not as high as the media likes to portray it as this being hyperbole. Yes, crime does exist, but there's so many peaceful and safe places in Chicago. It's no different from living in anywhere else. It's just based on scale, and if you compare it to city, Chicago's is just as safe as anywhere else. So I don't want people to be scared of coming to Chicago because it's such a beautiful city. It's got great parks that are actually, a lot of them are actually built over old railroad tracks, and some of it is the old landfill from the early 1800s. Chicago's got a lot of history. It's got a lot of great shops. The food is wonderful. But, that is basically the city of Chicago from its foundings, from a merchant, international traveler in John Baptiste Pont de Sable to its modern day metropolitan. It went from basically a trading post to a mega city, and that has a lot to do with the diversity of the country, the economic drive of Americans, or people who created the American dream. That's what Chicago represents. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, and subscribe it. Stay healthy, stay wealthy. As always, stay wise, Chicago.